In today's episode, I visit with Ben Colton, Global Co-Head of Asset Stewardship at State Street Global. We take a deep dive into State Street Global's 2020 Asset Stewardship Report.
This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to Across the Board on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Across the Board is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and today I'm extraordinarily pleased to have back with you Ben Colton. Ben, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks, Tom. I really appreciate the opportunity to be back.
Ben, could you tell us both your current role at State Street Global Advisors and a little bit about your professional background?
Yeah, so currently I'm the global co-head of our asset stewardship team. I'm based in the U.S. and I oversee both North America and APAC region. Previously, I was working on the asset owner side, actually in Europe for the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So I see coming at this from both the asset owner side and also now currently in the asset management side, looking at ESG issues from across the globe.
Ben, we've had the recently released 2020 Asset Stewardship Report, and although, frankly, I look forward to the report every year, I've never thought this particular report was more prescient and more important this year. So could I start with perhaps how is the report developed?
Yeah, so the report's developed really over the course of the year, and it draws on the insights that we gather through our engagement in our voting activities. The report is really meant to provide transparency, not only to our clients, but also to the companies that we invest in and other stakeholders as well. So it helps us be accountable for our actions, and it also helps us really highlight what are best practices, what are the insights that we've gleaned from corporate engagements. Also, we use it as an opportunity to outline the trends that we're seeing in the market and our progress against our goals that we've outlined.
And perhaps I should have said why I think this year is so important. Obviously, the last year, most of the country has been struggling through the coronavirus health crisis and attendant pandemic, but we also had major eruptions and changes around the social justice movement, human capital, diversity and inclusion, and other issues. One of the most prescient comments I've heard is we had 5 years of change crammed into the last 12 months. So that's why I think this report is so important, that not only it speaks to some of the trends that you guys saw, but hopefully will give us guidance on how to move forward. And that really starts with some of the key takeaways. What were they for you from the 2020 Asset Stewardship Report?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head. It really is about the coronavirus and how that's accelerated a lot of the trends that we've seen that were already kind of in play. Number one, social issues, as you mentioned as well, have risen to the absolute top of the agenda from boards. First it was driven by the coronavirus, and then, as you mentioned, the tragic events in the U.S., specifically in the summer last year. So both of those have really amplified the focus from board members, from executive management teams and companies, but also really from investors. So we want to understand how companies and boards are thinking about human capital management. How are they thinking about employee health and safety? How are they thinking about supply chain management and resilience, or keeping not only their employees safe, but their customers safe as well? How has coronavirus impacted executive compensation, for example, impacted business strategies? How are companies pivoting their strategy to readjust to really a new environment? How are they thinking about crisis management? Obviously, the coronavirus, the pandemic was very difficult to predict. But what kind of processes do they have in place to think about crisis management or contingency planning? And lastly, about succession planning. What does that look like? How can they deal with multiple absences? Do they have the right expertise on the board? Do the board members have enough time to commit to, if they're sitting on 3 or 4 boards and also a named executive officer, maybe they don't have enough time to sit on all these companies and provide input, because we've heard some companies that are counting the board meetings that they had in 2020, and I've heard examples of triple digits, which is remarkable. That's every other day pretty much board meetings are occurring at some companies. So those are the issues that we've talked about a lot, but really the highlight is showing how coronavirus has changed the engagement landscape and how particularly social issues have risen to the very top of the agenda.
You have one of the great phrases that I hope many people are using, and that's stewardship with impact. What does that mean to you and State Street Global?
Yeah, I think stewardship with an impact is really about prioritization, transparency, and also, using an accountability mechanism. So not only the carrot, but also the stick. What I mean by that is first and foremost, we set our expectations, and we're really transparent on our expectations. Here's what our priorities are. Here's what disclosure expectations are. Here's what good looks like. This is what best practices are. We go in and talk to companies, and we use the engagement as one of the tools at our disposal. So we're talking with board members, we're talking with executive management teams on these issues that are important to us as a long-term investor. But the impact is also about accountability. So how are we using our vote in tandem with what we're expressing publicly and what we're talking to companies about privately? How do we use our vote to ensure that the board and executive management teams are held accountable for really executing on these issues that are important to us, whether it's a systemic risk related to racial and ethnic diversity, or if it's a systemic risk related to climate change? We want companies to make sure that this is important, address it, and be accountable to it.
Could you describe a couple of instances of engagement with either company management or the board on these types of issues?
Yeah, I think, let's use, racial and ethnic diversity as an example. In August 2020, we outlined why disclosure is important to us, why we're looking at this issue. For us, it's all about cognitive diversity. And we think that, racial and ethnic diversity are observable characteristics of cognitive diversity. And also we saw the headline risks and the reputational risks and the other systemic risks associated with not effectively addressing racial and ethnic diversity or DEI more generally. So we are laser focused on talking about issues like racial justice with boards and asking them to enhance their disclosure around these issues. So following our guidance in August of what we're looking for, we engaged with over 100 companies, understanding the challenges, understanding the opportunities, and understanding how companies are managing these and if they plan on enhancing their disclosure. So at the beginning of the year, we after all of these discussions, we instated revised voting guidelines where we're actually going to be, voting against companies that are laggards relative to our disclosure expectations. An example of where engagement is really interesting is we engage with a utilities company out of California, and this utility company, showed us their employee engagement surveys broken down by race, and they showed the historical trends of employee engagement by these groups, and they showed, they came to us and said, we have an issue here. The employee engagement or the engagement feedback from our Black employees has been deteriorating consistently over the last 5 years, and it's accelerated, after the tragic killings of George Floyd. They recognized that they had a problem. They disclosed to investors, this is something that we're focused on. We're going to find out the root causes to this, and here's the roadmap to improving our practices. So nobody is where they want to be in addressing this issue. Everybody has areas that they need to work on, including State Street Global or State Street Corporation that's announced 10 actions for improving our practices. But providing that transparency, giving a roadmap to investors and showing them how they're going to improve their practices, I think is meaningful, and it helps push the conversation forward and create accountability.
Ben, although I think we both agree that 2020 brought a lot of change, it didn't. It largely was around things that were already being discussed, and of course, one of those was ESG. But ESG now seems to have exploded, and I know State Street Global has talked about this for multiple years. In fact, I've had the chance to talk with you and your representatives about this. But What do you see around ESG, or rather the corporate response to ESG reporting?
Yeah, one of the trends that we saw in place, over the last 10 years was not only ESG reporting more broadly, but also reporting on, for example, climate-related issues. So shareholder proposals asking companies to disclose, more information around environmental issues. The disclosure was largely aligned with disclosure frameworks that we support. So on climate side, it's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financials Disclosure, the TCFD framework. On more generally, if you think about a really commonly accepted framework for ESG reporting, it's SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board's framework. So we encourage companies to disclose against this. As I was mentioning, climate-related disclosure over the last 10 years has been brought up to the forefront, but not only this framework, the TCFD, but also the shareholder proposal process and investors asking companies and requesting this information. What you saw over the course of the last 10 years was this, it's almost become table stakes, climate-related disclosure aligned with SASB, for example. But now we're seeing that additional disclosure is needed about the governance of environmental issues, so the G of E. And we're seeing that manifest itself through the shareholder proposal process, through investors' expectations. The coronavirus has accelerated, I think not only the coronavirus, but also, these conversations and really a fruitful engagement culture more generally has accelerated these conversations. And when you look at the evolution of social disclosure related to social issues or human capital management more generally, this evolution is going to take, I think, 12 to 18 months. So you're going to see a revolution in the quality and the quantity of disclosures related to human capital management very quickly. And you're going to see it through the shareholder proposal process manifest itself first asking for, baseline disclosure, which we're already seeing, but also, the governance of social issues. So how does the board have oversight of social issues? Is it in the company charter? Which committees? How often are they meeting on it? Is it on the board agenda and where? You're going to see that happen very, very quickly. And I think that more generally, you're going to start seeing investors and frameworks coalesced around a common set of disclosure expectations.
We have talked about human capital, we've talked about diversity and inclusion, and you've talked about board succession, but I wanted to ask you about board refreshment and how does that tie to greater diversity and inclusion at the board level?
Yeah, board refreshment has been a priority for us for many years, and we talked about companies. What do you have the right skill set? As the business evolves, do you have the right skills in the board? Most importantly, we want strong, independent, and effective boards that are having conversations. They're thinking about sustainability in the context of their long-term strategy. And the needs for companies are constantly changing, whether they need, more climate-related expertise, or they need somebody that is a deal maker or a connector or a more regulatory experience. So we're not prescriptive on telling companies, what kind of expertise they need, but we do engage to understand, what role boards play or what role directors or expertise that the directors have. So one of the things that's important, obviously, is diversity, and cognitive diversity is really what we're after. And there's many different dimensions. Board refreshment plays a role in diversity because there needs to be a healthy process, a healthy nomination process, one that's unbiased, one that's tapping into a broad, diverse network of qualified individuals. So companies need to. I don't think it's about an access or a pipeline issue when you think about putting a female director on the board or a racially or ethnically diverse director on the board. I think it's an access issue in thinking about this refreshment process and the nomination process as well. So when I don't see a female director on the board, or if I only see all white males, there's something wrong with the nomination process. There is a flawed nomination process. Companies might not be as innovative. There might be groupthink. A lot of academic evidence points to this. So I would question the nomination process if I'm seeing a board with all white males.
Yeah, if I could now turn to the most recent CEO letter, goals that laid out in that letter. And I wanted to ask, why is it so important to State Street Global Advisors that you publicly announce these? And how does that, I think, really help lend itself to leading in transparency?
Yeah, we're really crystal clear on what our priorities are this year, and really tone starts at the top. We are focused on the systemic risks related to human capital management and climate change, and our organization, as well as my team, are going to be laser focused on these issues. If you think about the pandemic and how it showed how systemic risks can have a material impact on companies, it really was clear. But then you think about that was an unpredictable or relatively unpredictable crisis that affected all companies and highlighted the systemic risks. But the impacts of climate change, for example, or the impacts of human capital management, the systemic risks associated with them, rather, those are predictable, those are real, and those are something that investors are asking about. So we're going to continue to push the dialogue forward, and we're going to be really focused on this in their engagement program. Expect enhanced disclosure expectations on both fronts in the coming 12 months. They also expect us to outline best practices and also enhance our accountability mechanism, which is our voting guidelines.
And as long-term investors, why does SSGA take such a broad view of sustainability as it relates to better business outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it starts with value. This isn't about our values or pushing our values onto companies. This is a question about what is going to maximize a company's ability to generate long-term sustainable returns, whether it's cognitive diversity, which I pointed to at the beginning, which is driving our push for greater gender diversity and racial and ethnic diversity as well, or if it's about climate change and really the overwhelming evidence showing that there are risks for stranded assets for companies that aren't adopting to a transition to a low carbon economy. Insurance company underwriting waterfront property in Palm Beach, for example. We want to understand these risks, and we want to understand, how companies are managing them, because ultimately, all of these issues that we're talking to with boards are going to affect, value. We fundamentally think that this is our responsibility as a fiduciary to hold companies accountable for integrating ESG into their long-term strategy.
And if I could turn to that veiled land of the future now and ask you, what do you think boards and senior management need to be thinking about down the road into 2025 or even beyond around ESG, diversity and inclusion, and sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think it's about how the board has oversight of these issues, how ESG is going to increasingly affect capital allocation decisions. When you think about the drivers of a company's value, human capital management or intangible assets have become such a huge driver, a majority of the driver evaluation in companies in the S&P 500, where 30 years ago it was all about tangible assets, property, plant, and equipment. So increasingly, are we seeing the company's most valuable asset are their people, is human capital. So how companies are thinking about their employees, their stakeholders. We see a new generation of millennials or investors and consumers that have changing preferences as well, and we also see climate change going to create an incredible set of opportunities, but also expose company to so many risks. So I think that boards need to be really focused on this and also understand that this is the future, and if you're not integrating ESG, then you're going to be less than dust, and you're going to expose your investors to outdo risk.
And unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted any additional information on the 2020 Asset Stewardship Report or this year's CEO letter. Where could they go to find it?
they can go to our website. Everything's publicly available on SSGA's Asset Stewardship website. So we have a lot of information there. We have our voting guidelines there. We have our thought leadership pieces there. So I'd encourage folks to go there.
Well, Ben, we're going to link, of course, to all of those assets and resources in the show notes. I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to come on the pod and visit with me. As I said, I was really looking forward to this report, and I was really looking forward to visiting with you about it. I think the acceleration of many of these trends is extraordinarily important, and I hope people start listening to the message you and your colleagues at SSGA have been saying for some time. So I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Tom, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for having me on board.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Across the Board. We're going to link to the State Street Global 2020 Asset Stewardship Report in our show notes. I would suggest you check it out. It's chock full of great information, and it will help every compliance practitioner to think through the issues of ESG, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you'll join us in our next episode in Across the Board, where we continue to explore issues related to boards of directors, compliance, risk management, and now ESG and sustainability. Across the Board is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.